What happens when the very system designed to protect us is weaponized against the innocent? In the scales of justice, we follow the intertwined journeys of Malcolm Carter, a fearless young lawyer fighting for equity, and Judge Theodore Wallace, a man whose courtroom has long been a symbol of bias. When Malcolm takes on the case of Andre Willis, a young black man wrongfully convicted of theft, he finds himself in a battle not just for one man's freedom, but against an entire system built to fail people like Andre. Along the way, surprising allies emerge, secrets from the past come to light, and one judge is forced to confront the choices that define his legacy. Can justice truly prevail in a town divided by prejudice? And what will it take for redemption to overcome regret? Before we dive in, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Let us know in the comments. What do you think it takes to truly fix a broken system? Stay with us until the end. You won't want to miss how this emotional and gripping story unfolds. Now, let's begin the scales of justice. The courtroom was a stage, and Judge Theodore Wallace, perched high on his bench, played his role with calculated precision. His gavel, polished to a mirror-like sheen, rested beside a stack of legal briefs he had barely skimmed. The case before him was an ordinary one, by the town's standards, a young black man accused of stealing from a convenience store. Malcolm Carter sat at the defense table, his expression calm, but the furrow in his brow betrayed his frustration. His client, Andre Willis, was no thief. Malcolm had combed through the evidence, or rather, the lack thereof. The security footage was grainy and inconclusive, and the lone witness, the store clerk, had been inconsistent in his testimony. Yet Malcolm knew how this would end. He had seen it happen before, here in this very courtroom. "All rise," the bailiff called, his deep voice echoing in the chamber. Wallace entered, his robe swishing as he ascended to his throne-like seat. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Malcolm before moving on. To Wallace, Malcolm was a fixture in his courtroom, a dogged young lawyer with too much ambition for his own good. As the trial resumed, the prosecution's closing arguments dripped with overconfidence. The assistant district attorney painted Andre as a product of his environment, leaning on coded language that Malcolm had come to recognize: troubled upbringing, urban neighborhood, and poor decision-making. When it was Malcolm's turn, he stood with measured calm. He didn't raise his voice or pound the table. Instead, he appealed to reason, presenting the gaps in the evidence with surgical precision. "The burden of proof rests with the prosecution," Malcolm said, addressing the jury. "And they have not met it. Andre Willis is not a thief. He's a son, a brother, a student with dreams. Do not let stereotypes convict him in the absence of facts." After deliberating for just 2 hours, the jury returned. Malcolm had been hopeful, but the speed of their decision left him uneasy. "Will the defendant please rise?" Wallace intoned, his voice devoid of empathy. Andre stood, his hands trembling. Malcolm placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Andre's mother sobbed quietly, her tears muffled by her hands. Malcolm clenched his jaw, his mind racing through the options for an appeal. Wallace's gavel struck the sound block with finality. "Sentencing will take place in 2 weeks. Court is adjourned." As the room emptied, Malcolm gathered his papers, his movements mechanical. Andre turned to him, his eyes wide with despair. "What happens now?" Andre asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We fight," Malcolm said, though his own faith in the system was faltering. Outside the courthouse, the sun shone brightly, a stark contrast to the heavy mood of the crowd gathered on the steps. Local activists had shown up in support of Andre, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Stop the bias." Reporters swarmed Malcolm, their questions blending into a cacophony. "Do you believe the verdict was fair? Is this part of a larger pattern in Judge Wallace's court?" Malcolm held up a hand, signaling for quiet. "The verdict reflects more than just this case," he said. "It reflects a system that too often fails people like Andre. This isn't justice, it's a travesty." His words made headlines the next day, drawing attention to the systemic issues plaguing the local judiciary. While Malcolm addressed the media, Judge Wallace retreated to his well-appointed home in the upscale part of town. His wife, Ellen, greeted him with a glass of bourbon and a warm smile. "Tough day?" she asked, noting the tension in his posture. "Same as always," Wallace replied, sinking into his leather armchair. Ellen nodded, accustomed to his curt answers. She knew better than to pry. Wallace rarely brought his work home, though the weight of it clung to him like a shadow. Later that evening, as Wallace reviewed his notes for the next day's docket, his daughter, Grace, appeared in the doorway. "Dad, can I talk to you?" she asked, her tone cautious. Grace was a law student with a passion for civil rights, a stark contrast to Wallace's conservative pragmatism. She had been following Andre's case closely and had questions that her father was reluctant to answer. "Do you think you were fair?" Grace asked bluntly. Wallace stiffened. "Fairness is subjective, Grace. I apply the law as it's written." "But the law isn't applied equally," Grace countered. "You know that." Their conversation ended in silence, the gulf between them growing wider. At his office late that night, Malcolm spread out a series of files across his desk. Each one represented a case he had lost in Judge Wallace's courtroom. The pattern was glaring. Black defendants convicted on flimsy evidence, harsher sentences for similar crimes compared to white defendants, and a clear disparity in how objections and motions were ruled upon. Denise, Malcolm's paralegal, leaned over his shoulder. "This isn't just bias," she said. "It's systemic." "I know," Malcolm replied, "but proving it is another story." They decided to begin collecting testimonials from former defendants and other attorneys, building a case not just against Wallace, but against the culture of bias that permeated the local judiciary. The next day, as Malcolm prepared to meet with community leaders, he received an unexpected visitor, Grace Wallace. "I believe you're right about my father," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Malcolm raised an eyebrow, surprised by her admission. "And what makes you say that?" Grace handed him a folder. "These are case summaries I compiled for a research project in law school. They show a pattern in his rulings that I couldn't ignore." Malcolm scanned the documents, his skepticism turning to intrigue. "Why are you doing this?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Grace replied. "And because I'm tired of pretending I don't see it." Armed with Grace's data, Malcolm began crafting a strategy to expose Wallace's biases. He reached out to journalists, legal experts, and civil rights organizations, laying the groundwork for a broader movement. Meanwhile, Grace struggled with the consequences of her decision. Her relationship with her father grew increasingly strained, their once easy conversations replaced by tense silences. "You're spending a lot of time in the city lately," Wallace remarked one evening. "I have friends there," Grace replied, avoiding his gaze. Wallace didn't press her, but a flicker of suspicion crossed his face. The small town of Fairhill wasn't used to making headlines, but Malcolm's public comments on systemic bias and Grace's quiet assistance had begun to stir the waters. Community leaders, particularly those who had long benefited from the status quo, voiced their displeasure at the courthouse steps and in town hall meetings. "Judge Wallace has served this town with integrity for decades," one prominent businessman, Hank Sorensen, said to a local news crew. "These accusations are nothing more than a smear campaign from outsiders who don't understand our values." Malcolm watched the broadcast in his modest office, frustration tightening his chest. "Outsiders," he muttered under his breath. "They're trying to make me the enemy instead of addressing the problem." Denise, his paralegal, shook her head. "They're scared, Malcolm. You're shaking up their comfortable little system." "That's the plan," Malcolm replied, though he knew the fight would only get harder from here. Grace sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by notes and folders from Malcolm's office. She had volunteered to help catalog his growing archive of cases, but the weight of her involvement was starting to press down on her. Her phone buzzed a text from her father. "Dinner tomorrow?" She stared at the screen, her heart sinking. She wanted to say yes, to cling to the semblance of their old relationship, but she knew that her work with Malcolm was a betrayal in Wallace's eyes. Finally, she replied, "Can't. Busy." Her father's response was immediate. "Too busy for family?" Grace set the phone down, fighting back tears. She had always admired her father's intellect, but now she saw the cracks in his moral foundation, and it was breaking her heart. Malcolm's research began to uncover stories that went beyond mere bias. They were indictments of a flawed system. One case, in particular, haunted him, that of Samuel Green, a man who had served 10 years for a crime he likely didn't commit. The more Malcolm read, the angrier he became. Samuel's conviction had been based on the testimony of a single witness, a white woman who later recanted her statement. The prosecution had withheld evidence, and Wallace, then a younger judge eager to prove his toughness on crime, had denied multiple motions for appeal. "This isn't just bias," Malcolm said to Denise as he paced his office. "This is deliberate negligence. And it's all part of the same pattern," Denise added. "We need to bring this to light." Malcolm nodded, his resolve hardening. He knew exposing Wallace's record would bring backlash, but the stakes were too high to ignore. Judge Wallace had begun to notice the whispers in the courthouse hallways. Conversations would stop as he approached, and the courtroom staff seemed more guarded than usual. Sitting alone in his chambers late one afternoon, Wallace stared at a photograph of his father, Judge Arthur Wallace, a towering figure in his life. Arthur had been a man of iron principles, or so Theodore had believed. But as he grew older, Theodore began to question whether his father's rigid adherence to law and order had been a mask for something darker. A knock at the door broke his reverie. It was his clerk, Margaret, carrying a stack of files. "Long day?" she asked, placing the files on his desk. Wallace nodded. "They're all long these days." Margaret hesitated. "People are talking about you, Judge. About your rulings." Wallace looked up sharply. "What are they saying?" "That you're being targeted," she said carefully. "But some are saying there might be truth to it." Wallace dismissed her with a curt nod, but her words lingered. The first protest outside the courthouse drew a modest crowd of activists and community members, their chants echoing off the brick walls. "Justice for Andre," they shouted, their signs calling for a fair retrial and an end to judicial bias. Wallace watched from his office window, his arms crossed. He had faced protests before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just noise, it was personal. Grace stood in the crowd, her hood pulled up to shield her face. She wasn't ready for her father to see her there. Malcolm took the microphone, his voice rising above the crowd. "This isn't about one judge," he said. "It's about a system that has failed too many for too long. We're here to say enough is enough." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Grace felt a flicker of hope. That evening, Wallace confronted Grace at home. "Were you at the protest?" he asked, his voice cold. Grace hesitated, but didn't lie. "Yes." Wallace's jaw tightened. "Do you know what you're doing? You're undermining everything I've worked for." "No," Grace said firmly. "I'm standing up for what's right." "What's right?" Wallace scoffed. "Do you have any idea what it's like to sit on that bench, to have the weight of people's lives in your hands? You think it's that simple?" "It's not simple," Grace shot back. "But it's not supposed to be about you. It's supposed to be about justice." Their argument ended in silence, the air thick with tension. Malcolm filed an official appeal for Andre's case, citing new evidence and alleging judicial misconduct. The motion was a calculated risk. It would put Wallace's record under scrutiny and force the appellate court to examine patterns of bias. Local news outlets pounced on the story, further polarizing the town. Supporters of Wallace called it a witch hunt, while activists saw it as a long-overdue reckoning. Wallace reviewed the motion in his chambers, his hands trembling slightly. He knew the evidence Malcolm had gathered was damning. For the first time, he felt the ground beneath him begin to shift. Grace couldn't sleep that night. She replayed her argument with her father over and over, the sting of his words lingering like a bruise. She opened her laptop and began typing an email to Malcolm. "Malcolm, I found something you might need for Andre's appeal. It's an old case file, but it shows a pattern in how my father handled similar cases." She hesitated before hitting send, knowing the consequences of her actions. Finally, with a deep breath, she clicked the button. Somewhere across town, Malcolm received the email. As he opened the attachment, a grim smile spread across his face. The pieces were falling into place. The courtroom was packed for the first hearing on Andre Willis's appeal. Activists filled the gallery, their quiet determination a stark contrast to the combative mood of the prosecution. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, knowing the case had become a flashpoint in the growing debate over judicial bias. Malcolm stood tall as he addressed the appellate judge. "Your Honor, we are here today not just for Andre Willis, but for the principles of justice. The original conviction was based on flimsy evidence and perpetuated by implicit bias. We have new evidence that was ignored during the trial, evidence that could exonerate my client." Across the room, Judge Wallace sat silently in the audience. His name was not mentioned, but his presence was palpable. For the first time, Wallace saw his courtroom not as a place of order, but as a stage where lives were shaped or destroyed by the choices he had made. The appeal stirred further division in Fairhill. Letters to the local newspaper alternated between support for Malcolm and staunch defenses of Wallace. "Judge Wallace is a pillar of this community," one letter read. "To attack him is to attack Fairhill itself." Malcolm read the letters with a mix of frustration and resolve. "They don't see it," he said to Denise. "They're so invested in the myth of fairness that they can't see the reality staring them in the face." "Then we'll make them see it," Denise replied. At home, Wallace's relationship with Grace had become icy. They avoided the topic of the appeal, speaking only in clipped phrases about mundane matters. One evening, Grace finally broke the silence. "Why didn't you recuse yourself from Andre's case?" Wallace sighed heavily. "Because I didn't think I needed to. I thought I could be impartial." "And do you still think that?" Grace asked, her voice soft but insistent. Wallace didn't answer, but the look on his face spoke volumes. Malcolm's appeal began gaining traction when a civil rights organization offered its resources to support the case. The group brought in experienced researchers and lawyers who helped Malcolm craft a detailed argument exposing not just the flaws in Andre's trial, but the broader pattern of judicial bias in Wallace's rulings. Grace continued to provide Malcolm with documents and insights, though she grew increasingly conflicted. "This isn't just about the law for me," she admitted one evening at Malcolm's office. "It's about my family." "I know," Malcolm replied gently, "but what you're doing matters. You're helping more than just Andre, you're helping everyone who's been hurt by this system." The appeal hearing stretched over several weeks, with Malcolm presenting a compelling case for a retrial. The evidence he uncovered: new witness testimonies, procedural errors, and instances of overlooked exculpatory evidence painted a damning picture. The prosecution fought back, accusing Malcolm of exploiting racial tensions for personal gain. "This is nothing more than a circus," the prosecutor declared, "an attempt to discredit a respected judge and undermine the justice system." Malcolm countered with calm precision. "If pointing out the truth undermines the system, then maybe it's the system that needs to change." As the appeal moved forward, Wallace found himself increasingly isolated. Colleagues who had once admired him now kept their distance, wary of being associated with controversy. At the local diner, where Wallace had eaten breakfast every morning for years, the usual friendly chatter gave way to awkward silences. The waitress hesitated before bringing him his coffee, her usual warm smile replaced with a tight-lipped nod. For the first time in his career, Wallace felt the sting of public scrutiny. The appellate court finally delivered its decision. Andre Willis's conviction was overturned, and a retrial was ordered. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. Outside the courthouse, Malcolm stood beside Andre and his family as they addressed the media. "This is a victory," Malcolm said, "but it's only the beginning. There are countless others like Andre who deserve justice, and we won't stop until they get it." The crowd cheered, but Malcolm's mind was already on the next steps. Wallace returned home that evening to find a stack of hate mail waiting for him. Most of it came from anonymous senders, their words laced with venom and threats. He sat at the kitchen table, sorting through the letters, when Grace entered the room. "Why are you doing this to yourself?" she asked. "Because I need to face it," Wallace replied. "I need to understand what I've become." Grace sat down across from him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and compassion. "Then let me help you." In an unexpected turn, Wallace reached out to Malcolm for a private meeting. They met at a neutral location, a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. "I need to understand," Wallace said, his tone uncharacteristically humble. "What are you hoping to achieve?" Malcolm studied the older man carefully. "I want justice not just for Andre, but for everyone who's been hurt by a system that doesn't see them as equal." Wallace nodded slowly. And what do you want from me? Accountability, Malcolm replied. Start by admitting where you went wrong. Publicly. Wallace hesitated, the weight of Malcolm's words pressing down on him. I'll think about it. With Andre's retrial set to begin, Malcolm and his team worked tirelessly to prepare their case. They received an outpouring of support from the community, with volunteers offering everything from office supplies to meals. Meanwhile, Wallace began revisiting old case files, seeking to understand the full scope of his past decisions. The process was painful, each file a reminder of the harm he had caused. One night, he came across the file for Samuel Green, the man Malcolm had been researching. Wallace stared at the pages for hours, the memories of the trial flooding back. I failed him, Wallace whispered to himself. I failed them all. Wallace's self-reflection turned into action. He quietly reached out to Samuel Green, the man whose wrongful conviction had lingered in his thoughts. Green was working at a community center, mentoring young men recently released from prison. When Wallace arrived unannounced, Green greeted him with wary skepticism. What do you want? Green asked, his tone flat. I came to apologize, Wallace said, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. I can't change the past, but I want to make it right. Green crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. You think an apology will fix 10 years of my life? No, Wallace admitted. But it's a start. Their conversation stretched into the evening, a difficult but cathartic exchange that ended with a handshake. Wallace left the community center feeling both lighter and more burdened. Grace, inspired by her father's meeting with Green, dug deeper into the cases that had defined his career. In Malcolm's growing archive of court documents, she found patterns that went beyond bias instances where evidence had been mishandled, defendants had been poorly represented, or rulings had disproportionately impacted marginalized communities. One case in particular stood out, that of Naomi Rivers, a young black woman sentenced to 5 years for a first-time drug offense. Grace remembered her father's explanation at the time. We need to send a message. The memory stung. Grace printed the file and brought it to Malcolm. She's still in prison, Grace said, placing the papers on his desk. We have to help her. Malcolm read through the file, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. We will. The retrial of Andre Willis became a spectacle, drawing national attention. The prosecution doubled down, relying on the same flimsy evidence that had secured the original conviction. Malcolm, however, was armed with new tools. He presented evidence of procedural errors, called new witnesses, and directly challenged the racial biases that had influenced the first trial. During his closing argument, Malcolm's voice was steady but impassioned. Justice isn't about conviction rates or keeping up appearances, he said. It's about truth. And the truth is that Andre Willis didn't commit this crime. He deserves his freedom. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with their verdict. Not guilty. Andre collapsed into his mother's arms, his tears a mix of relief and exhaustion. Malcolm shook his hand, but his expression was solemn. The victory felt hollow against the backdrop of a system that had failed so many others. The verdict sparked mixed reactions. Supporters of Andre celebrated in the streets, chanting his name and calling for broader reforms. Opponents, however, accused Malcolm of exploiting the system and claimed the jury had been swayed by public pressure. Wallace, watching the news coverage from his living room, felt an odd sense of pride in Malcolm. He had witnessed the young lawyer grow from an idealistic upstart into a formidable advocate for justice. Ellen, his late wife's sister, called him that evening. Do you regret any of it? She asked. Wallace hesitated. I regret not seeing it sooner, he admitted. Malcolm's victory in Andre's case inspired other wrongfully convicted individuals to come forward. His office was inundated with calls and emails from people seeking his help. Among them was Naomi Rivers, whose case Grace had uncovered. Naomi's sister, Claire, reached out to Malcolm, sharing details of Naomi's trial and the harsh sentence that had derailed her life. This is the next one, Malcolm told Denise, and it's going to be even harder than Andre's case. Grace volunteered to help, despite the personal cost. I need to do this, she said, her voice resolute. For her, and for me. Under increasing scrutiny, Wallace decided to address the community. He called a press conference, his first in years, to discuss his past rulings and his vision for change. Standing before a crowd of reporters and townspeople, Wallace began with a confession. "For decades, I believed I was upholding justice," he said. "But I see now that my actions often perpetuated injustice. I failed to see the humanity of those who stood before me, and for that, I am deeply sorry." The crowd murmured, some skeptical, others moved. "I can't change the past," Wallace continued, "but I can dedicate the rest of my life to making sure the system becomes what it was always meant to be: fair and impartial." The press conference marked a turning point. While not everyone accepted Wallace's apology, it opened the door for conversations about accountability and reform. Naomi Rivers's case became a litmus test for the alliance between Malcolm and Wallace. The two met frequently, sometimes in Malcolm's office, sometimes at the diner on the outskirts of town. Wallace offered insights into the judicial process, helping Malcolm anticipate the prosecution's moves. For Malcolm, the collaboration was uneasy but necessary. "I still don't trust you," Malcolm said bluntly during one meeting. "I don't expect you to," Wallace replied, "but I trust you to do what's right." Their shared goal, justice for Naomi, drove them forward, even as tensions simmered beneath the surface. Naomi's hearing was a grueling affair. The prosecution argued that her sentence had been appropriate given the charges, while Malcolm highlighted the disparities in sentencing compared to similar cases involving white defendants. Wallace attended every session, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom. His presence drew whispers, but he ignored them, focusing instead on the arguments being made. On the final day of the hearing, Malcolm delivered a powerful closing argument. "Naomi Rivers isn't just a name on a docket," he said. "She's a woman who has been stripped of her freedom because the system failed to see her humanity. Today, you have a chance to correct that failure." The judge ruled in Naomi's favor, reducing her sentence and ordering her immediate release. The courtroom erupted in cheers, and Naomi hugged Malcolm, tears streaming down her face. Outside the courthouse, Wallace approached Malcolm. "You did good," Wallace said, extending his hand. Malcolm hesitated before shaking it. "We did good." For the first time, there was a sense of mutual respect between the two men. It wasn't friendship, but it was something close to understanding. The release of Naomi Rivers was a major victory, but it also sparked significant backlash. Protests against judicial reforms erupted in the town square, with a group of vocal opponents claiming that Malcolm and Wallace were tearing apart the foundations of justice. Wallace watched the protests from his office window, a heavy weight settling on his chest. He had always been a respected figure in Fairhill, but now he was a lightning rod for anger and resentment. Grace arrived with coffee, placing the cup on his desk. "They're scared of change," she said. Wallace sighed. "Or they're scared of losing control." "You're doing the right thing, Dad," Grace said, her voice steady. "I hope so," he replied, though doubt lingered in his eyes. While Fairhill reeled from Naomi's case, Malcolm's attention shifted to another pressing matter: Elijah Roberts, a black man serving a life sentence for a murder he insisted he didn't commit. The case was riddled with inconsistencies, missing evidence, coerced witness statements, and a timeline that didn't add up. "This is bigger than anything we've handled before," Denise said as she reviewed the files. Malcolm nodded. "If we can prove Elijah's innocence, it could dismantle the foundation of bias that's upheld this system for decades." Wallace, hearing about the case from Grace, offered his help once again. "This one will be the hardest yet," he said, "but it's worth it." The trial to overturn Elijah's conviction became a national story. Malcolm faced relentless opposition from the prosecution, which was determined to maintain the original verdict. Wallace, though not presiding over the trial, used his influence to support Malcolm's efforts. He spoke at community forums, advocating for the importance of revisiting past convictions to ensure justice. During one such event, Wallace addressed a hostile crowd. "I understand your anger," he said. "I've made mistakes, terrible ones. But our duty is not to protect our pride. It's to protect the truth." Some in the audience nodded, while others remained unconvinced. The hearing to exonerate Elijah was marked by dramatic testimony. Malcolm brought in expert witnesses who discredited the forensic evidence used in the original trial, while the prosecution leaned on emotional appeals from the victim's family. The most shocking moment came when a key witness admitted under cross-examination that he had been pressured by police to identify Elijah as the suspect. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Malcolm asked. "I was scared," the man replied. "But I can't let him rot in prison for something he didn't do." The revelation caused a stir in the courtroom, and Wallace, sitting in the gallery, felt a flicker of hope. The town's mood shifted as the hearing progressed. The protests against reform dwindled, replaced by quiet conversations in cafes, churches, and community centers. People began to question the stories they had long accepted as truth. Malcolm and Wallace met late one evening at the diner where their uneasy alliance had begun. "You think we'll win?" Wallace asked. "We have to," Malcolm replied. "Elijah's life depends on it." Wallace nodded, his expression grim. "And so does the soul of this town." The judge overseeing Elijah's case took 3 days to deliberate. When the decision finally came, the courtroom was packed, with reporters lining the walls and the gallery overflowing with supporters and skeptics alike. "Elijah Roberts," the judge began, "the court finds sufficient evidence to vacate your conviction. You are free to go." A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by cheers and tears. Elijah stood frozen, his hands trembling as Malcolm embraced him. Wallace watched from the back, his eyes misting. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of redemption not for himself, but for the system he had helped repair. Elijah's exoneration sent shockwaves through the legal community. National news outlets picked up the story, hailing it as a landmark case for judicial reform. Civil rights organizations called it a victory, while critics accused Malcolm and Wallace of setting a dangerous precedent. Wallace received a flood of letters, some congratulatory, others venomous. He read each one carefully, recognizing that his journey toward redemption was far from over. While Malcolm celebrated Elijah's freedom, he couldn't ignore the toll the case had taken on him. Long hours and relentless pressure had strained his relationships, particularly with Grace. "We're fighting for the same thing," Grace said during one of their rare, quiet moments. "But sometimes it feels like we're on different sides." Malcolm looked at her, his exhaustion evident. "I can't stop Grace. Not until this system is better." "I know," she replied softly. "But don't forget the people who are fighting with you." Fairhill began to change. Sentencing disparities decreased as reforms took root, and more people came forward to share their stories of injustice. Malcolm's legal foundation expanded, offering representation to those who had been overlooked for too long. Wallace continued to work quietly behind the scenes, mentoring younger judges and advocating for systemic change. He knew he would never fully atone for his past, but he found solace in knowing he could help shape a better future. Elijah Roberts became a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform, traveling the country to share his story. He often mentioned Malcolm and Wallace in his speeches, crediting them with giving him his life back. At a rally in Atlanta, Elijah said, "Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about fairness, about understanding, and about making things right when they've gone wrong." Malcolm, sitting in the audience, felt a surge of pride. Wallace and Malcolm's partnership remained complicated. They respected each other, but knew their pasts would always cast a shadow over their work. During one of their final meetings, Wallace said, "You'll keep fighting, won't you?" "Until there's nothing left to fight for," Malcolm replied. Wallace smiled faintly. "Good. Don't let them win." When Elijah Roberts stepped out of the courthouse as a free man, the sunlight felt foreign on his skin. He paused at the top of the courthouse steps, taking a deep breath as the crowd erupted into cheers. Journalists shouted questions, their cameras flashing, but Elijah ignored them. Instead, he turned to Malcolm. "What happens now?" Elijah asked, his voice raw with emotion. Malcolm placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Now, we make sure this never happens to anyone else." Wallace, standing in the distance, watched the moment quietly. He felt a pang of guilt mixed with a flicker of hope. Elijah's freedom was a victory, but it was also a stark reminder of the many lives his decisions had impacted. Despite Elijah's release, the backlash continued to grow. Conservative commentators framed the case as an attack on law and order, while some of Wallace's former allies openly accused him of betraying his judicial oath. At a local town hall, Wallace faced a hostile crowd. "You're supposed to uphold the law, not tear it apart," shouted one man from the back of the room. Wallace responded calmly, his voice firm. "Upholding the law means ensuring it serves everyone equally. If that makes me unpopular, so be it." The crowd was split, some nodded in agreement, while others muttered discontentedly. Wallace knew he couldn't change everyone's mind, but he was determined to keep trying. Encouraged by Elijah's victory, Malcolm decided to revisit the case of Samuel Green, the man Wallace had wrongfully sentenced years ago. Samuel had been out of prison for years, but had struggled to rebuild his life. Malcolm approached Samuel with the idea of seeking compensation for his wrongful conviction. "They owe you more than an apology," Malcolm said. Samuel hesitated. "I don't need money. I need people to know the truth." Together, they filed a motion to reopen the case, aiming to expose the systemic failures that had led to Samuel's imprisonment. Wallace, aware of his role in the case, offered to testify on Samuel's behalf. The hearing for Samuel Green's case drew national attention. Wallace's decision to testify as a witness against his own record was unprecedented, and the courtroom was filled to capacity. When Wallace took the stand, the room fell silent. He adjusted his glasses and took a deep breath before speaking. "Decades ago, I presided over Mr. Green's trial," Wallace began. "At the time, I believed I was following the letter of the law, but I see now that I failed to uphold its spirit. I allowed my biases to cloud my judgment, and Mr. Green paid the price." Samuel watched from the defense table, his expression unreadable. For him, this moment was about more than vindication. It was about finally being seen. During the hearing, new evidence surfaced that painted an even darker picture of Samuel's case. A key piece of exculpatory evidence, a witness statement that could have proven his innocence, had been suppressed by the original prosecution team. The revelation caused an uproar in the courtroom. The presiding judge ordered an immediate investigation into the misconduct, while Wallace sat quietly, his face pale. "I should have seen it," Wallace said to Malcolm afterward. "I should have questioned it." Malcolm nodded. "But you're helping fix it now. That matters." The court officially vacated Samuel's conviction, and he was awarded a settlement for his wrongful imprisonment. Samuel, however, chose to donate a portion of the money to Malcolm's legal foundation, ensuring that others in his position would have access to justice. At a press conference, Samuel addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about all the people who never got a second chance. Let's make sure they're not forgotten." Inspired by Samuel's bravery, Wallace decided to publicly release a list of cases he felt needed re-examination. The list included names of individuals who had been disproportionately affected by his rulings, sparking a wave of new investigations. The move was both praised and criticized. Some saw it as a genuine attempt at accountability, while others accused Wallace of undermining the integrity of the judiciary. Grace, watching her father from the sidelines, felt a surge of pride. "You're doing the right thing," she told him later. "I hope so," Wallace replied, "but it doesn't make up for what I've done." As Malcolm's work intensified, the pressure began to take its toll. His sleepless nights and relentless schedule strained his relationships with his team and with Grace. "You can't keep doing this to yourself," Grace said during a rare, quiet moment together. "I have to," Malcolm replied. "There's too much at stake." Grace placed a hand on his arm. "You don't have to do it alone." Malcolm nodded, though he wasn't sure how to let go of the burden he had carried for so long. Slowly but surely, Fairhill began to change. The courthouse implemented new policies to ensure transparency, and the local police department partnered with community leaders to address racial profiling. Malcolm's legal foundation expanded, hiring a diverse team of young lawyers eager to continue the fight for justice. Wallace, though retired, remained an active mentor, offering guidance and insights from his years on the bench. One evening, Wallace visited the community center where Samuel Green now worked. The two men sat on a bench outside, watching as children played in the fading light. "You've come a long way," Samuel said. "So, have you?" Wallace replied. Samuel smiled faintly. Do you think we've done enough? Wallace shook his head. No, but it's a start. Fairhill's transformation continued to ripple through the town. The courthouse became a symbol of reform, implementing mandatory bias training for judges and lawyers, and new policies ensured that sentencing was reviewed for equity. For the first time, Black families in Fairhill began to feel a cautious hope. The changes were incremental, but they were real. Town hall meetings grew larger, with community members advocating for new initiatives like affordable legal aid clinics and restorative justice programs. At one such meeting, Malcolm stood at the podium, addressing a crowd of young people eager to get involved. Justice isn't just what happens in a courtroom, he said. It's what we build together in our neighborhoods, in our schools, and in our hearts. Grace watched from the back of the room, pride swelling in her chest. Despite the positive changes, the push for reform continued to face resistance. Local business leaders, many of whom had long benefited from the status quo, threatened to withdraw funding from public programs if the reforms persisted. Malcolm met with Grace to discuss the fallout. They're playing the long game, Grace said. They think if they wait long enough, the momentum will die down. Then we won't give them the chance, Malcolm replied. We'll keep pushing, louder than ever. Wallace, overhearing their conversation during a visit to Malcolm's office, added, You'll face setbacks. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that perseverance wins in the end. Wallace's list of cases continued to spark reviews, resulting in several overturned convictions and reduced sentences. He dedicated his retirement to mentoring young legal professionals, holding workshops and speaking at law schools about the importance of equity in the judiciary. During one such workshop, a student asked, What advice would you give to someone just starting out? Wallace paused before answering. Listen, he said simply. Listen to the people standing before you, not just to the letter of the law. Justice starts with empathy. His words resonated, and afterward, several students approached him to thank him for sharing his journey. Months later, Wallace's health began to decline. Grace visited him regularly, often bringing Malcolm along. Despite their complicated history, Wallace and Malcolm had grown to respect one another deeply. One evening, as the sun set over Fairhill, Wallace sat on his porch with Malcolm and Grace. The conversation turned to the future of the town. You'll carry this forward, won't you? Wallace asked Malcolm. Malcolm nodded. We will. Together. Wallace smiled faintly. Good. That's all I could ask for. Wallace passed away peacefully in his sleep a few weeks later. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including the many lives he had touched during his later years. Malcolm delivered the eulogy, his voice steady despite the emotion in the room. Judge Wallace wasn't a perfect man, Malcolm said, but he was a man who chose to change. He taught us that justice isn't about where you begin, it's about where you choose to go. His legacy isn't the mistakes he made, it's the courage he showed in confronting them. Fairhill continued to evolve, with Malcolm's legal foundation growing into a national organization. Grace, now a practicing attorney, worked alongside him, focusing on cases that highlighted systemic inequalities. One day, as they prepared for a new case, a young law student approached Malcolm. I grew up in Fairhill, she said nervously. You're the reason I'm here. I want to fight for justice, like you. Malcolm smiled, seeing himself in the young woman's eyes. Then let's get to work. The Fairhill Courthouse was renamed the Theodore Wallace Justice Center in recognition of Wallace's contributions to reform. A plaque in the lobby bore the inscription, For those who fought for justice, and for those brave enough to change. Malcolm visited the courthouse often, walking the halls with a mix of nostalgia and determination. He knew the work wasn't finished, but he also knew the foundation was stronger than ever. The final scene unfolded at a community celebration in Fairhill's Central Park. Families gathered for food and music, children played on the grass, and the atmosphere was one of cautious optimism. Malcolm and Grace stood together, watching the scene. Think we've done enough? Grace asked. Malcolm shook his head. Not yet, but we're getting there. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a warm, golden glow, Malcolm felt a sense of peace. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time, he believed they were on the right path. Months after Wallace's passing, the changes he and Malcolm had initiated continued to ripple outward. A new group of young judges began their terms, all graduates of the judicial mentorship program Wallace had founded. These judges came into the courtroom with fresh perspectives, emphasizing fairness and impartiality. Among them was Judge Elena Martinez, a first-generation lawyer from a low-income background. At her swearing-in ceremony, she spoke of her commitment to making the law accessible to everyone. Justice isn't just for those who can afford it, Martinez said. It's for the single mother fighting to keep her home, the teenager facing a system that doesn't understand them, and everyone who believes in fairness. Malcolm watched from the audience, his heart swelling with pride. Samuel Green, whose case had been a catalyst for much of Fairhill's transformation, became a community leader in his own right. He expanded the community center where he worked, using part of his settlement to fund job training programs and educational workshops for formerly incarcerated individuals. During a town hall meeting, Samuel addressed a packed room. "We can't change what happened," he said, his voice steady. "But we can build something better for the next generation. Let's make sure they don't have to fight the battles we did." Grace, sitting in the front row, applauded enthusiastically. She had worked closely with Samuel in recent months, finding inspiration in his resilience and determination. While much progress had been made, not everyone was ready to embrace the changes. Hank Sorensen, one of Fairhill's most influential business owners and a vocal opponent of reform, requested a meeting with Malcolm. Malcolm agreed, though he approached the meeting with caution. "I'm not here to fight," Sorensen began, his tone surprisingly conciliatory. "I want to understand why you're so determined to upend everything we've built." "Everything we've built?" Malcolm replied, raising an eyebrow. "Do you mean a system that only works for some?" Sorensen hesitated. "I'll admit, things weren't perfect, but is tearing it all down the answer?" Malcolm leaned forward, his expression softening. "It's not about tearing it down. It's about building something better, something that works for everyone. If you want to be part of that, we'd welcome your help." Sorensen didn't respond immediately, but his thoughtful expression suggested that Malcolm's words had struck a chord. Fairhill held its first annual Justice Day, a community-wide event celebrating progress and honoring those who had fought for change. The event featured speeches, performances, and booths highlighting local organizations working for equality and fairness. Malcolm was invited to deliver the keynote address. "As we look to the future," Malcolm said, "we must never forget the lessons of the past. Progress is never easy, and justice is never guaranteed. It's something we must fight for every day, in every corner of our lives." The crowd erupted into applause as Malcolm stepped down from the stage, joining Grace and Samuel in the audience. Grace's work as an attorney took her beyond Fairhill, where she began tackling cases of systemic injustice on a broader scale. Her passion for advocacy led her to join a national civil rights organization, where she worked to create policies that addressed inequities in housing, education, and healthcare. During a visit home, she and Malcolm reflected on how far they had come. "You think Dad would be proud?" Grace asked, her voice tinged with emotion. "I think he'd be proud of you," Malcolm replied with a smile. Grace laughed softly. "And you? You've done more than anyone to carry his legacy forward." Malcolm shrugged. "It's not about me. It's about the work." The impact of Fairhill's transformation began to show in its youth. At a high school career day, a young student named Jamal stood up and announced his dream of becoming a lawyer. "I want to help people the way Mr. Carter does," Jamal said. Malcolm, who had been invited as a guest speaker, felt a lump in his throat. He walked over to Jamal after the event and handed him his card. "When you're ready, give me a call," Malcolm said. "We'll make that dream a reality." In the final scene, Malcolm stood on the courthouse steps, the same spot where he had first fought for Andre Willis's freedom. The town around him bustled with life, its streets filled with a diverse and hopeful community. Grace joined him, carrying a folder of new cases. "Ready for the next fight?" she asked, her tone light but determined. Malcolm nodded, a faint smile on his face. "Always." As they walked into the courthouse together, the camera panned to a plaque near the entrance. It read, "Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey. May we walk it together with courage and compassion." Thank you for listening to The Scales of Justice. If this story moved you or gave you something to think about, please consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful and thought-provoking content. Don't forget to like this video, share it with others who believe in the power of stories to inspire change, and leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. Together, let's keep exploring narratives that challenge, inspire, and bring us closer to justice.